Hello, everyone. Welcome to our December briefing. We're so happy to have you here. My name's Erica Edelson. I'm the communications director for Ruby. And we are so excited to have with us today Thomas Frank to give us a brief history of progressive populism, which is, we at Ruby think is becoming increasingly relevant, the past, present, and future of whether you want to call it progressive populism, prairie populism, agrarian populism, probably, more relevant than ever and important for us to understand its roots and its potential in the future as we go about our work. Thomas is an historian. He's an extremely prolific political commentator, founded the Baffler magazine, right, and ran that for many years, and has written quite a few books. The three most relevant for us are What's the Matter with Kansas, Listen, Liberal, and The People Know. And for some of us at Ruby, all three of those books have been really important that really deepened our understanding of where the Democrats have gone wrong with rural and working people. And that's been such a big theme for us and such a big part of Thomas's work that he has shed so much light on. So without further ado, Thomas, thank you for being here, and tell us all about progressive populism in 30 minutes or less.
Yeah, you ready for this? We're gonna so Erica asked me to cover 4 general topic areas in 30 minutes, and it's gonna be tough, but we're gonna do it. And then we'll open it up for questions, and you guys will, whatever I didn't talk about, you'll get me to talk about it then. Okay, so started off, who were the populists? Populism was a political movement in the 1890s. I wrote The People Know. Let's see if I got a copy of it that I can show you. Well, you know what it looks like. Yeah, there it is. It looks like that. I wrote it because I was the word populism was being used basically everywhere and by everyone as though it was obviously a negative, a pejorative thing. Populism was what you didn't want to be. Populism was Trump. Populism was dictators. Populism was like Putin, various other bad guys around the world. And I know something about populism. I wrote about it and researched it when I was in graduate school. But more importantly, I'm from Kansas. And the word populism comes from the state of Kansas. Not many people know this, but one of the things I discovered while I was doing the research for The People Know is the exact circumstances, and in fact, the exact week when the word was invented. It was on a train between Kansas City and Topeka in May of 1891. And what the word meant was what the word referred to when it was invented was a group of fairly radical left-wing farmers who had gone into politics in a huge surprise to everyone. It was the last big third-party movement in U.S. history. The last successful third-party movement. The idea was, so the Democrats and Republicans were sort of regional parties back then, in the aftermath of the Civil War. And the idea of populism was that it was going to be a class-based party. So farmers and factory workers against bankers, monopolists, landlords, that kind of thing. So if you had to put them in today's political spectrum, what would they be? They would be, roughly speaking, social democrats. So this happens at about the same time as the Labor Party in England, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, the Labor Party in Australia, and it's pretty much the same phenomenon happening all over the world, only in America it's more agricultural than it is in those other countries where it tends to be more labor-oriented. Anyhow, what did they want? What were their political objectives? Well, they wanted agricultural price supports. That's what we call it today. They had a different term for it. They wanted to nationalize the railroads, which are of course, monopolies. And they wanted currency reform. They wanted to get the country off of the gold standard. Do you all know what the gold standard was? So I can explain that later if you guys. They wanted to take the U.S. off the gold standard, which then eventually happened in the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, all of the things that the populists wanted eventually came to pass. They eventually did, of course, get a farm program. We didn't nationalize the railroads, but we did regulate them, etc. Anyhow, the style of the populist party was very sort of man of the people-ish. Their leaders tended to be people a lot like the rank and file, farmers or small town newspaper editors. They believed really profoundly in the rank and file. So they believed in mass education. These were not highly educated people. These did not, farmers in the 1890s were not college educated people, but they believed that they had to get educated up in order to understand the issues. And so they had this sort of massive campaign of popular education through pamphlets, newspapers, and lectures. They had constant lecture tours, Chautauqua style gatherings out on the prairie, that kind of thing. Another thing that they were known for was their really profound belief in democracy, in everyone voting, everyone participating. These were the people who basically started the idea of the initiative and referendum. Those were populist innovations. They brought the secret ballot to America. Before populism, you could easily see who someone was voting for because they used a party ballot that was often a bright color or something like that. They supported women's suffrage and so on. They were the first big political party to do so. What did the populists do? Well, they were players on the American political stage for about 10 years, from about 1890 to about 1900, and they were basically gone by 1900. But started out with a huge bang in the year 1890. They were particularly strong on the Great Plains and in the South, wherever people were farmers, wherever people were doing badly, wherever there was economic depression. And they were a successful third party movement because they elected people up and down the ticket. They didn't just run somebody for president, in the manner of like Ross Perot or or Ralph Nader or something like that. They didn't just run somebody for president and forget about the rest of it. They had candidates for everything. They had in Kansas, they had 2 governors, a bunch of senators, a bunch of members of Congress, mayors, everything. So they were a real party, and they contested elections all up and down the ballot. The adventure of the populist party, like I say, it began with a bang in the year 1890. And then in 1894, the country went into a terrible business depression. And you had, hard times all over the country, and sort of spectacular reactions to this. There was the first ever March on Washington happened. It was a march of unemployed people on Washington, and it was led by a populist. It was called Coxey's Army. Not many people remember it today, but it was the model for all of the marches on Washington that came afterwards. You also had an enormous strike on the railroads. It was called the Pullman strike, and it was led by a guy called Eugene Debs, who is famous for later becoming a socialist and running for president from prison. Where looks like we might be seeing that again this year. But he was a populist at that point in his career. And then things came to a head in the year 1896, which was a national election year. We're going to elect a new president, and something kind of crazy happened. So the Democratic Party met for its convention in Chicago. And the first thing they did, the sitting president was, in fact, a Democrat, a guy called Grover Cleveland, very conservative Democrat who was a believer in the gold standard. And the Democratic Party said, we're not interested in this guy anymore, basically threw him overboard, announced that they were turning against the gold standard, and nominated a guy called William Jennings Bryan for president. William Jennings Bryan was a one-term congressman from Nebraska, was the youngest person ever nominated by a major party for president. He was 36 years old. And he had a kind of oratorical genius, and he talked like a populist. He used a lot of their phrases and that sort of thing. But in fact, there was only one issue where he was with the populists, and that was the currency issue, where he wanted what was called free silver. He wanted to take America off the gold standard and put us on a silver standard instead. And I can explain why they wanted to do that. That was very important to them. But the important thing to understand is that it wasn't just an idle a culture war issue or something like that. It was very, very real. The gold standard was a very real issue, and it really was dragging farmers down. And it was, nobody runs a modern economy on the gold standard, and there's a really good reason for that. And the populists understood that early on. Anyhow, Bryan gives a spectacular speech at the Democratic Convention about the gold standard. The speech is called the Cross of Gold speech. And the convention is bowled over by his ability, by his vision, and they nominate this guy for president. The country is absolutely thunderstruck. And the Eastern press, immediately starts denouncing him. And the word that they use for denouncing him is populism. They think that he is a populist and that the populists have basically captured the Democratic Party. It's not exactly the case. But nevertheless, about a month later, the populists met for their convention. And here the Democrats have stolen their number one issue, which is free silver, taking the country off the gold standard. Democrats have stolen their issue. They don't know what to do. So they nominate Bryan also. Now, this is a big gamble for the Populist Party. They realize that Bryan is not with them on all of their other issues, but he is with them on this one big issue of the currency, what to do about the currency. And so they go ahead and they make this tremendous compromise, and they endorse Bryan. They get on board the train. Everybody thought Bryan was clearly going to win. He was an inspiring figure, a man of extraordinary talent, a man of destiny, like Napoleon or something like that. And so they thought that this was a good idea to get on board with him. Now, in response, the Republicans nominate a guy called William McKinley, who was the great protectionist of his era, wrote, these treaties, putting up huge tariff walls. And McKinley was also a gold bug. He was, very solid in favor of the gold standard. So the Republicans basically pull out all the stops to defeat William Jennings Bryan. They raise an extraordinary amount of money. If you judge it by if you measure it by as a term, as a size of the economy, of per capita income, it was the most expensive election of all time. They outspent the Democrats and the populists by something like 20-1, possibly 30-1. We don't really know because they weren't required to report what they spent back then. But it was, an overwhelming amount of money. They used every trick in the book, every trick known to the 19th century political mind. And of course, they succeeded. They defeated William Jennings Bryan. And in the aftermath of that sort of beatdown, the populists took to fighting with one another. Their leadership had basically sold them out to get on board with this guy who then lost. This looks really bad. And the party very quickly fell apart. And veterans of the populist party basically went back to their old parties. So in Kansas, they went back to being Republicans. In other places, they went back to being Democrats. A lot of the leadership, who tended to be pretty radical, signed up with the Socialist Party, like Eugene Debs. The third subject that Erica asked me to talk about was, why was populism so hated? Why was it so incredibly controversial at the time? Because if you look back at the issues that they stood for today, they don't seem very controversial at all. You know, they wanted a modern way of organizing the currency. They wanted railroad regulation. They wanted votes for women. They wanted, you know, of various farm reforms. They wanted things like rural free delivery. These are all common sense reforms. They're all and you go down the list, they had a whole lot of other reforms they wanted, and all of them seem like really like a no-brainers today. But at the time, they were regarded as insanely radical. And their name, the word populism, became a kind of curse word to the nation's cultural elite. And what you see in 1896 is this extraordinary coming together of the nation's elite against the threat of William Jennings Bryan, or the threat of what they called populism. I'm going to give you an illustration of it. This is what they thought populism was. See that guy in the middle there? They see his cape. It says populism. He's right out of the French Revolution. He's wearing a French, a liberty cap marked anarchy. He holds a knife marked murder. And here he's got Eastern capital on the run. You see, he's coming out of the West and he's chasing Eastern capital. They can't believe what is happening to them. It's the class war, basically, is what they saw it as. It's the end of the world. You know, this is what they'd always dreaded. So that, you know, the 19th century was a very conservative time, and it basically, for, you know, the entire 19th century, there's this constant fear of democracy, of a repeat of the French Revolution, and that's what they thought populism represented. And they, like I said, they came together against it in this extraordinary coalition of the elites, and they put it down. But what's really fascinating is that they took the word populism and made it a synonym for insolence. The idea is working people from the bottom rung of society trying to rise above their station. Okay, they use the word populism to describe a mental disease, a kind of mass hypnosis. They said that populism was anti-intellectual. It was an uprising against learning and possibly against the mind itself, because populism was against the gold standard, and all the economists of the world agreed on the gold standard. So hence it was anti-intellectual. And today you look back at this elitist denunciation of populism, and it's quasi-aristocratic. It's openly elitist. But nobody was ashamed of that back in the day. You know, you look through their magazines, through the magazines of these sort of the way I did the research for this is there were a bunch of political humor magazines published in New York City. They tended to be lavishly illustrated. I mean, very beautiful illustrations. And you flip through the magazines, and they're filled with the most toxic, you know, poisonous, reprehensible cartoons of blacks, of Jews, of immigrants, you know, Irish, Germans, whatever, Italians. They particularly hated Italians, and farmers and populists. These were all the different groups that they hated. These were the lower orders, and they had to be kept in their place. And that's all there was to it. That's what anti-populism was then. And the story is fascinating, and I don't want to go into it now because I got to try to get through the points that Erica wanted me to address, but we can talk about it later. Over the decades, that aristocratic contempt for mass democracy and for ordinary people migrated from the extreme right wing, which is what these guys were, the McKinley people, to the left. And today you see that all of those same attitudes, those exact same attitudes, being vocalized or expressed by liberals. Erica wanted me to talk about the sort of identity politics aspect of populism. Where did they stand on those issues? So one of the most remarkable things about the populist movement was that, and this is unique for the time, they were the only party back then that had female leaders. So in Kansas in particular, the party had two very prominent women leaders. One of them was this outrageous personality who used to travel around the state giving speeches, and she would say, "You farmers have to raise less corn and more hail." Anyhow, this was very unusual for the time. The Democrats and Republicans obviously did not have any women in leadership positions. They were not in favor of women's suffrage, which the populists were. And in fact, the populists not only were in favor of it, they got women's suffrage passed in Colorado and in Idaho. On racial questions, the populists, the racial issues were extremely important then as they are today in the South. And the populists grew out of a farmer, what would you call it? A farmers union style movement that was called the Farmers Alliance. And it had an African-American wing. They were the two alliances were segregated, but what this meant was that there was a group that historians call the Black populists. And so the idea, the sort of populist idea in the South was to bring the Black farmers together with white farmers around their shared economic interests. Now, they were not like enlightened sort of anti-racist liberals as we think of such people today, but by the standards of the day, they were pretty radical on this stuff, and they were, even though they were not, particularly enlightened by our modern standards, they represented an enormous challenge or threat to the Southern ruling elite, who tended to do who acted through the Democratic Party at the time. Now, there were, up until, this was again the 1890s, from the time of the Civil War up until the 1890s, in different Southern states, there had been a number of attempts to bring together poor Black farmers with poor white farmers for some kind of combined political action. And populism was the biggest of these efforts and the most threatening to the ruling elite. And this was a constant threat, but it sort of came to a head with populism. And so what happened was the sort of ruling elite of the South realized that they had to do something, and they came down on populism like a ton of bricks and basically crushed the movement. And the way they crushed the movement was by mobilizing race hatred. So in North Carolina, the only Southern state where the populists came out on top was North Carolina. And they were actually destroyed in North Carolina in 1898 in a campaign organized by the Democrats that was actually called the White Supremacy Campaign. And it involved at one point the armed overthrow of a city government in Wilmington, North Carolina. It's the most incredible story. It's the only successful coup d'etat in American history. And it was done to stop this populist this alliance between blacks and whites in North Carolina. And by the way, this is where Jim Crow came from. The Jim Crow laws were passed in the aftermath of populism to make sure that something like this never happened again. And there's a great Martin Luther King speech on this subject where he's at the very tail end of Jim Crow as it's being repealed by the Voting Rights Act in 1965. King gave a wonderful speech in Montgomery, Alabama, talking about where Jim Crow came from. And he talks about populism and how it was a threat to the Southern ruling elite. On immigration, the populists had a plank in their platform where they said they were against pauper immigration, but the other two parties also had the same very similar wording. It was basically all of them said this. But what was interesting about the populists is that they were not in earnest about that. They actually, in fact, tried very hard to recruit immigrants to the Populist Party and had a great deal of success in that regard. And we know in Kansas, they had a sort of running war with the big anti-immigrant hate group of the day. The last point on this is that in the 1950s, a group of American historians started accusing the populist movement of anti-Semitism, but this was the historians basically dropped this very quickly. It turned out it was a fairly it was something of an exaggeration. But anyhow, I think I've touched on all the points, and if you guys want to go to I almost did it in half an hour. So if you guys want to start taking questions, I don't know how you want to do the questions. I mean, because as soon as you turn that on,
well, we think the culprit is gone, and in any event, there's no screen sharing capability anymore, so they won't be able. They'll only be able to say horrible things, not display them. I think we're going to be good. Thank you so much for that. That was incredibly interesting. Let's try. We have a fairly big group, but I'm going to try letting people ask their questions in addition to putting them in chat, if that's your preference. But go ahead and raise your little Zoom hand if you'd like to come off mute and ask a question. Let me just get started with one, which is, are you aware of anything in modern times? Like what's the most similar effort, analogous effort in modern times to the populist movement?
Well, so in the book I describe the populist, basically the spirit of the Populist Party becomes the Democratic Party in the 1930s. I think there was the New Deal era had very populist overtones to it, and I mean that both politically in terms of what they did. The Farm Bill, obviously, Henry Wallace as Secretary of Agriculture, then Vice President, the Federal Reserve, the regulation of Wall Street. All of these were populist ideas that were picked up by the Democratic Party. So the Democrats really became the sort of bearers of the populist tradition beginning in the 1930s. And that sort of dies out with Bill Clinton and the New Democrats in the 1990s, or even earlier, depending on how you look. I mean, a guy like Lyndon Johnson, nobody knows this, Lyndon Johnson's grandfather was actually a member of the Populist Party, was a state legislator who was a populist, and he had a very sort of populist way about him, believed in a lot of their issues. But that Democratic Party dies out with the New Democrats, who shift the emphasis to, instead of working people, college educated people. And they do that openly. That's not me conjecturing about it. They said this. That's how they see the party going. I think Bernie Sanders, and I don't want to sort of reopen like all the political conversations of the last few years, but I think of Bernie Sanders as someone who's very much in the populist tradition. There were a lot of guys in the 70s who really wanted to revive populism. Anybody remember Fred Harris from Oklahoma? He was very much in the populist tradition and was also, really strong on civil rights stuff. That sort of thing. So it's basically, my definition of populism is a working class, sort of multiracial working class movement that focuses on economic democracy. And there's lots of people, by that definition, there's lots of people out there, especially in the Democratic Party, who fit the bill. Anyhow.
Yeah, great. Okay. Susan Heath, why don't you come off mute and ask your question?
Thank you. I'm curious. Thank you for what you've presented, and I'm curious if you've read through the World New Deal that Ruby and the Progressive Democrats of America have proposed, and what you think about that and how it relates with populism.
I'm sorry to say I haven't read through it recently. I probably did some time ago. But look, one of the reasons that all of this stuff is so important now is, I'm not from a rural area. I'm from Kansas City, or the Kansas suburbs of Kansas. If anybody is out there from Kansas, I'm from Johnson County. And but whenever I'm home, Kansas is a farm state, so is Missouri. And whenever I'm driving around, I'm always astonished to see what has happened to small town America, which I remember from, when I was a child and from the 1980s. I remember very vividly as being a place that was just as prosperous as the big city. And did everything, they had all the, they had all the sort of things, they had a main street and they had a high school, and they had sort of normal American middle-class lives. And I drive around now, and it's just the most shocking and disheartening thing. And what's funny is, and I've written about this many times, this is in What's the Matter with Kansas, it's in all sorts of other places. What's funny is that this has been going on for decades. And our political leaders, either they throw up their hands and say, well, there's nothing can be done about this, nothing we can do to help those people, nothing we can do to help the farm economy. And it just burns me up. It makes me so angry because, I can come up with things just off the top of my head. You guys can come up with all sorts of things. There's no reason why small towns are not economically viable anymore. There's no reason. There's no good reason for that. We've allowed these corporate predators, monopolies and agricultural middlemen and stuff like that to ruin farming as a way of life in this country, and to ruin small towns. I mean, Walmart. I mean, Jesus H. Christ, you guys know this. And so, yeah, okay, I'm shutting up. Next question.
Okay. Thank you. Bruce Menke, how about you?
Well, I'm in Athens, Georgia, and I'm certainly not an expert. We've only been here 10 years, but there is nothing, absolutely nothing, in terms of representatives elected by and chosen by rural Georgia that echoes, resonates, relates in any way, shape, or form to the historic progressive movement. And I'm saying this as a shocked person.
Yeah.
Because rural Georgia is in serious trouble. Hospitals are closing, schools are underfunded, access to health care is minimal. And what I have not understood is why the representatives from those areas are not leading the charge for the kinds of reforms you're talking about. It's a mystery to me. I don't get it.
That was when I started out. That's what I wrote my book, What's the Matter with Kansas, about, because these people are literally the descendants of populists, and they're voting for more and more right-wing politicians who only make their problems worse. And Kansas has produced some, and a lot of corporate Republicans too. These are the worst guys, right? And these guys who do nothing but help out the big agricultural middlemen, and it's, and these are my, elected politicians, Sam Brownback. What was his name? Who wrote Freedom to Farm? No, it drives me absolutely crazy. And I decided, that was 2004. That was literally 20 years ago when I wrote that book. And I tried to get to the bottom of it. Georgia's problems are different than Kansas. The people in Kansas are different than the people in Georgia, obviously. But I tried my best to understand it, and the problem has only grown worse since then. And I think there's a lot of aspects to it. I mean, we all know about how easily people are. So the one that I focused on, we all know about how race issues have played, but there's also a lot of these are good people, in my opinion, who could be brought back if the message was right. I mean, there's so many aspects to this, but the one I focused on in What's the Matter with Kansas was the culture wars, because I was watching friends of mine get sucked in by the culture wars. And I mean, these days I find myself getting sucked in by the culture wars. It never seems to end. I mean, it never ends. That's the beauty of it. It just goes on. There's always always something to get outraged about. And Fox News, they pipe that right into everybody's home. And it drives, anyhow, it's very, very powerful. Look, this is the question that you asked is the question of our time. And there are so many different ways of getting at it. So my last book before this one was called Listen Liberal, and it was about how the Democratic Party. So What's the Matter with Kansas was a sort of study of this right-wing culture where I interviewed their leaders and I asked them, why are you doing this? And don't you see this is bad for people and stuff like that? And then Listen Liberal, I looked at the Democratic Party and what went wrong there, right? Because this wasn't just the Republicans. This was bipartisan. This is fully bipartisan. And I looked at how the Democratic Party drove these voters away, which is also a shocking story. Anyhow, there's blame to go around. There's enough blame for everybody here. But the thing is that the time for blaming is over. Something needs to get done. And, I don't know what to say anymore. I'll say one last thing. One of the things that made populism possible was that it was a mass movement. And we don't have mass movements anymore. We have television instead. So people don't join mass movements. And even if they did, I mean, the television is a poor substitute, but it's something. Well, we don't have TV shows or a TV network, that's populist. That kind of politics isn't represented in a sort of mass way that people can participate with. And that's the thing that's absent from our world today. It still lived when I was a kid with organized labor, and you had various farmers unions type of things. And it still survived a little bit, but organized labor was basically clubbed to the ground in the 1980s, and the farmers unions have dwindled in strength along with them. And that's, now the sort of populist ideals have basically, you go to a place like Wichita, Kansas, or any small town in Kansas, and they have zero presence. That kind of political outlook, which used to be what everybody in those towns believed, everybody, and now you have nobody. So anyhow, all I can say is, look, I've written about this and written about it and written about it and written about it, and I'm done with writing about it.
Well, we'll keep you talking about it for at least another 15 minutes. There was a related question in the chat in terms of how did this all happen? How did the culture war, take over everyone's brains? And someone had a question about the role of nationalization of media, corporatization of media, and the demise of local media.
Yeah, well, that's a big part of it too. I mean, newspapers, right? So when I talk about these towns in Kansas and Missouri, almost all of them have lost their newspapers. And the Kansas City Star, the newspaper from the big city, is just it is a shadow of its former self. It's basically it's basically nothing. I shouldn't say that. It's a few pages. This is obviously an enormous part of the development. Populism was largely a movement of newspapers and small town newspaper editors. So one of the great things about it is they the populists, they're easy to research because they talked constantly. They had newspapers in every small town. There'd be in every town in Kansas, you'd have a Republican paper, and then you'd have a populist paper, and they would be going at it hammer and tongs. They fighting with one another, and that was. It was very lively, and that's, of course, that entire culture is gone. But it's been dying for a long time, and the consequences of that are enormous. And we all know now that social media is no substitute for that. For a long time, there was this hope that social media would fill in the gaps. Well, that's not going to happen. We also thought that nonprofit foundations would step in and fill in the gaps. Well, that is happening in some places, but that's just your nonprofit foundations run out of New York City or Geneva, Switzerland, or something like that, running a newspaper in small town Missouri. Sorry, that's that's just a non-starter as far as I'm concerned. No. So yeah, that whoever pointed that out is exactly right.
No. Anthony, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Well, I wanted to ask a question on behalf of one of the chat, and then I have a question of my own. The chat question was from Edward, who's been active in the chat, but he at one point asked if those original prairie populists back in the 1890s, where they stood on immigration at that point. You did mention that they had a position, an ostensible position, but they actually recruited immigrants.
Yeah, they did. They took
coalition, but did they generally take the stance that immigration was welcome versus immigration being a problem?
Well, they of course had it both. They tried to have it both ways. So but this is, you have to judge them by the standards of the day, and the like I say, the Republican Party and the Eastern newspapers and all that were extremely hostile to immigrants. I mean, in a disgusting, in a vicious way. And you didn't see that with the populists. Now, they did have a plank in their platform in 1892 that was they were against what was called pauper immigration. The reason they had that plank in their platform was that was the price. What the Knights of Labor, this was a big labor union back then. That was the price of getting the Knights of Labor on board, getting them to sign off on the platform. And they said, well, okay, so we'll do it. But at the same time, they then nominated a guy for president, their presidential candidate that year in 1892. I forget his name, Weaver, I think. Yeah, James Weaver from Iowa was in favor of unlimited immigration. So he's going around the country campaigning for total unlimited immigration, and his platform says we should restrict immigration. So they would have it both ways. Now, the other important thing is that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party also had planks in their platform demanding immigration restrictions. One of the fun things when I was a young man, I did a lot of research on populism, and back then to do it, this is before the internet, to do that research, you had to go to the state archives in the states where populism was powerful and dig through. They usually would have these collections, and the collections were extraordinary. And I would go up to Topeka and dig through their, the actual physical pamphlets and stuff that the populists had issued 100 years before. It was wonderful. I don't think you're allowed to do that anymore. But one of the things that I found, I'll remember this as long as I live, was some populist campaign document, and it was in English, German, and Danish. I don't know why Danish, but but there were a lot of Germans in Kansas at the time, and a lot of Irish. There's a huge Irish influence on the populist party. They were the one group that they did denounce very regularly was the English. They tended to be Anglophobes, and historians think that's because of the Irish influence on the popular, or that's one of the reasons, one of the many reasons. Also, the English were the world's great superpower at the time, the great colonial hegemon. They were the bulwark of the gold standard, and so the populists tended to badmouth England a lot.
Yeah. Erica, I'm going to defer my question because we've got a lot of people in the queue. I will say to folks who are new to Ruby, those who've been coming for a while know this, that an awful lot of what Thomas has talked about is precisely the kind of things that Ruby is very much working to address, to flip not only the Democratic Party, but the whole liberal progressive establishment's approach to these issues. And the Rural New Deal that we published a couple months ago is very much inspired by a lot of these populist progressive things. But I'll just stop there, and Erica, you can pick up in the queue if you would.
Okay.
Can I just say one last thing about the Rural New Deal? It is shocking when you read the story of the 1890s how similar their problems are to our problems today. Obviously, the gold standard is not an issue anymore, but the whole problem of monopolies, billionaires, the very strong middleman, all of that is still in full effect. And it's a lot of this is because the fundamental economic position of farmers and small towns has not changed, and that is they're disorganized. There's millions of them, and it's very difficult for them to come together. Whereas it's very easy for a Walmart or a Monsanto or what's one of the big meat packers, to work their will in the world, right? They are it's a single organization with a board of directors. They do what they want, but it's very difficult for farmers to organize themselves and fight back. It was then, and it is today.
Yep. Okay. Let's see, Monty.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. With apologies for not having read your books. I'm interested in bridging the gap, and in order to bridge the gap between rural and urban, got to get the policies right, and you've been speaking to that. But I'm concerned about the identity divide, the tribal disaffection that rural people that I come into contact with have for Democrats, and how to address that. Any thoughts you have on that would be really helpful.
It's huge, and it's extremely difficult to overcome. But I would look. What I used to always say was the obvious thing is so I'm I was about to say I'm fundamentally an optimist. I should say I used to fundamentally be an optimist about human nature and about Americans and about my people in Kansas. I like them. I think this is the populist in me. I really like, those people that I was brought up among. My ancestors were farmers from Iowa. I like farmers from Iowa. I like farmers from Kansas. I think they're great people. And I think that they are, having faith in the common man is my political religion. That's who I am. I have to believe what I'm about to say. And that is that if you give these people the right issues and the right movement and the right way of engaging, they will come around, and that you can overcome the sort of the ugliness that's out there. One of the reasons that the culture wars are so effective is because this is something that I discovered when I was writing What's the Matter with Kansas, and effective even on good people, is that they are couched as class war. It's always these, Eastern know-it-all elites or California elites. It's always the word elite, right? Who are telling you how to live your lives and, regulating you in some incredible, they've gone mad, right? They're enforcing something on you without knowing anything about your lives. There's a reason the culture wars work, is because they really do talk about these people's class position or these people's perceived class position. They don't respect me. They treat me, and that is true. We live in a capitalist society, and yes, the people who run this country don't respect, my people out in Kansas or my people in Iowa. That is very true, and they perceive that, and they are correct to perceive that. What's absolutely maddening is that Fox News or Donald Trump is able to make himself the expression of that very legitimate anger. I've been talking about this for 20 years. I used to talk to to Democrats about this. Then they stopped inviting me. They didn't they didn't want to hear it anymore. And then Donald, look, it's impossible to avoid it now. Trump talks about it all the time. And when Trump is gone, the next Republican will talk about it all the time. This is not going away. It's populism through the looking glass. It's like they've taken all these the sort of cultural sense of what's the word that I'm looking for here? The cultural sense of oppression, and they have turned it around. You know, they've divorced it from the economic circumstances, and they've made it entirely a matter of culture and resentment. And I have to believe, this is my political religion, my faith. I have to believe that when you turn it right side up, that it is very powerful, and that ultimately my side will win.
Yeah. Well, everything you just talked about are huge themes for Ruby. For those of you who follow our work, we talk about this problem of like the unforced errors that Democrat elites make all the time, that like make people feel like, you know, we look down on them and see them as deplorables. I mean, yeah, so feel free to check out a lot of our work on that. Okay, we're kind of running down on time a little bit, so let me see who else we can get to. And Beth, you've had your hand up for a while, so go ahead.
By the way, I see that some of the people in the comments have definitely read my books. They're quoting me back to myself, which is always nice to see.
Hi, you just touched on one of the questions I raised, but before I get there, I just want to say I live in a semi-rural town, and I've done a lot of canvassing door to door, and what you said is absolutely true. When you present the policies that are in their best interest, you find people are on your side, and I'm a progressive, and I talk that way, but I don't use the terms progressive, conservative, blah, blah, blah. I talk policy with folks. The thing that
yeah. That's my experience as well. So, I mean, farmers obviously know their business. And if you, like, just an example here, basically everybody knows their business, but if you talk to farmers about the problem of monopoly and like what is the word they use? The chickenization of the different sort of agriculture, of the different things that they produce, they know what you're talking about. And they are pissed off about it. I mean, they're angry as hell about it. Yes. So keep going.
So the last comment you made was what I was going to bring up. I'm very concerned how Trump and his ilk, and even just conservatives are and someone put it in the chat too, are using the word populism, and they're really not populist. I really can't stand when people say the word conservative populism, because I think that's an oxymoron, and I don't think it's at all. So I'm very concerned. And
that's why I wrote the book. But I have to swallow my pride on that. There's no way we can stop them. They've taken the word. By the way, so I trace how that happened. So up until the 1950s, everybody who talked about populism knew what it was. It was this movement in the 1890s. It was this left-wing radical group. And then in the 1950s, you had this new generation of American historians. And they were called the consensus historians. And the idea was that dissent was dysfunction. So America had always been a nation of consensus. We all believed the same things. We agreed on all the big issues. And whenever you had movements or groups that were disagreeing or causing trouble, there was something wrong with them. There was nothing wrong with the country. There was something wrong with those people. And that was the sort of historical sense in the 1950s. So one of the most famous of these historians, it was a guy called Richard Hofstadter, wrote a book about populism where he psychoanalyzed them, and he decided that they were like mentally ill. There's this kind of mass psychosis. I'm sort of exaggerating, but not much. And he, but basically, yeah, he thought the populists were in the grip of all of these delusions. They were anti-intellectual. There was all of these things wrong with them. And basically what it comes down to is that he had a different vision of reform. His idea was that reform has to come from people like him, like, professors at Columbia University sitting around a big table in Washington, D.C. He said this, not professor at Columbia University. We talk about lobbyists and experts and people who know what they're talking about. They sit around a table in Washington and they hammer out the details, and that's how you get reform. And that's how things get done in America. The populist model was to have a mass movement. Populism was, among other things, the largest mass movement in American history. Millions and millions of people protesting. I mean, by the per capita, the largest thing that's ever happened, largest mass movement that's ever happened in America. And that was their model for getting things done. We have to educate the millions. We have to educate the common man, because this is a democracy, right? The common man is who rules, ordinary people. So that's who we have to educate. And Hofstadter said, no, that is a recipe for disaster. That is, that way, people who don't know what they're talking about will get in power, et cetera, and it will never succeed. But this way does succeed, he said, the consensus way of educated people sitting around a table in Washington and making deals with one another. And the funny thing is, he's completely wrong about that. That's completely, anyhow, in the service of that argument, which is completely wrong, he trashed populism. And other historians corrected him and said, no, Hofstadter, you got it wrong. And after a very short amount of time, nobody was reading his book about populism anymore, or nobody was taking it seriously anymore. But the funny thing is that his vision of populism was embraced by the sort of intellectual elite in this country. They love it. They love that vision, even if it's wrong. It's actually a fascinating thing. And so they decided that populism was the word to apply to, these mass movements that are in the grip of some psychosis or other, that are racist, that are anti-intellectual. Those are populist movements. As a matter of fact, they aren't. It's a misnomer. It's based on a historical mistake. But that mistake is very flattering to certain people. And so that mistake is not going away anytime soon. We have to live with it. So that's why I wrote the book, to sort of put that whole development, that whole history into context. But I don't see that we're gonna win that dispute anytime soon. This is one of the things that what's the passage from the Bible? The race is not to the swiftest, nor the battle to the strongest, and nor the argument to the guy who's right. You get it? The argument, they use this word because they like it. They use this word because they dislike people like you. That's why they use it. And it makes sense to them. It's flattering to them to think that ordinary people can never understand, can never figure out their own problems, and that we have to resolve them with, the foreign policy blob here in DC, a bunch of guys down on K Street figuring it all out for the rest of the world. I think I've said enough.
Are you, well, no, almost, not quite though. Are you able to stay another 5 or 10 minutes for folks?
I could do 5 more minutes. I could do 5 more minutes. They're sending me, they're trying to get me, they're sending me a discount to one of my favorite barbecue stands in Kansas City.
Well,
Just came over the screen.
We can't compete with that. So before
I'm 2,000 miles away from it, so I can't. I'm in DC myself right now, so I can't go visit them. But
too bad. David and Craig, I'm going to get to you in just a second. But since some people are having to hop on the hour, I do just want to, Anthony, real quick, if you could announce next month's briefing, so people can have that on their radar.
First Wednesday in January, 4 o'clock, which I think is January 3rd. Jackie, you can check me on that. 4 o'clock, January 3rd, we have Joan Williams. Joan, who's a law professor at the University of California, Hastings. It should be really great. Joan's going to be focused on what she's come to call the diploma divide, which will absolutely overlap some of what Thomas has been talking about in terms of moving towards educated elites. and will also overlap a good bit of what Ruby has been talking about in terms of the rural-urban divide. So don't miss it. Joan Williams, first Wednesday in January.
Great. Okay. So
by the way, there's a point that I wanted to make earlier that I forgot to make, which is that we had a populist moment in 2020. It felt like, with Black Lives Matter. What happened was that I thought when I saw that, I was like, well, this is going to become a populist movement. It's very close. It was very close to one. They had their slogan, Black Lives Matter, was very populist. And a lot of their aims in the beginning, at least, had a lot to do with economic stuff. But unfortunately, that never happened. So, look, there is a tremendous appetite out there, desire for a new populist movement. And I think if we were to see another example, Occupy Wall Street, again, they really hit a nerve. They blew it, but they hit a nerve with their slogan, with a lot of the ideas. And it never became the populist movement that it should have become. But like I say, there is an appetite for these things, and we've got to have something like that really nails it on, that hits it on all cylinders, and then it would be unstoppable.
David Newman, you've been waiting so patiently. Go ahead.
I am looking for issues that can lead to some kind of a populist movement in the next year, to try to bring people together, to galvanize them. And it seems like it's impossible to do it without at least using the framework of a major party. And for example, I live on the left coast in the greater Seattle area. And here, there's really no alternative to the Democratic Party. And they really have a pretty good organization. And of course, also nationally, the Democratic Party is running on the internet a collection of meetings of all kinds of small groups that are trying to deal with the problems of the country, especially the removal of democratic controls in a lot of states, the efforts to stop, to restrict voting, the ignoring of the climate crisis, and the inequality in income, which was Bernie Sanders' big issue, which you mentioned him as a populist. How do you, for example, on the climate, there's the slogan, "There is no planet B." Let's take care of it now. We're about to burn the whole planet down. Yeah. And this is something that would definitely unite urban and rural communities. And yet,
well, you have
any comments on the climate in particular?
Well, not really, except for every farmer knows that climate change is happening. That's something that you can observe. I can observe that as a gardener here in Maryland. The annual flowers that have become perennials. But look, you started out saying you want to build a populist movement. You want to do it fast. This is, look, and you know what the issues are. You mentioned several of them. Of course, they have to be expressed in a language that's open to that's open to everybody. We all hate what's happening economically, but when you say inequality, people's eyes glaze over because it's technical. I was going to say healthcare. This is just, it makes people so. I had both parents hospitalized last year. I spent a lot of time in hospitals. Oh my God, I could talk for hours about the problems with the American healthcare system, and so can most people know about this. There's all sorts of things you can organize about, and what you guys are talking, your rural issues specifically, the problems of monopoly and the all-powerful middlemen. This is very well known. Everybody in small town America knows about it. Walmart, this is something that people both love and hate. They love the low prices. They hate what it's done to their downtowns. There's got to be an answer somewhere. That's why we have a political system. And the thing is, how do you build a movement out of this, right? And you want to build the movement separately of the two major parties. And this is tough. It's hard. The way that they built movements in the past, so history is my business, and the way you built movements in the past is you appealed to people directly in a way that directly benefited them. So you signed up with the Farmers Alliance. This is the group that became the Populist Party. You signed up with the Farmers Alliance, and it had very specific benefits for you as a farmer. They had a speakers bureau, and they had a newspaper, and they helped you out in your your job, your calling, your occupation as a farmer. You look at organized labor, which had its populist moment in the 1930s and swept over this country in a way that we haven't seen since. And again, they were speaking to people where they lived. They're talking about the actual conditions of their work. You look at the civil rights movement in the 1960s, when they would go to these small towns in the South and organize voters. And this is really interesting story, and the civil rights movement had a very populist side to it. There was a group called SNCC, what was that, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they were actively anti-leaders, right? They didn't like leaders. They had some great lines, but they would go to these small towns in the South and they would organize ordinary people, and it was about those people's lives. It was about them, and the movement, as we all know, caught fire. This is how it's done. So mass movements are difficult to build, but I mean, the issues are out there. The issues are out there. I don't know what, I'm waiting to see what happens next, but there's no doubt in my mind that you're going to see something happen next. Something has got to happen. It cannot go on like this.
Amen to that. Are you game for one more question, Thomas?
Sure.
Okay, Craig, close us out.
Well, what I'd like to do, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, thank you. What I'd like to say, Thomas, is I am the Rural Caucus Chair of the Ohio Democratic Party. I also serve as the Wyandotte County Chair. I ran for Congress in the last cycle.
Wyandotte County, Ohio?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
where the Wyandottes actually originated from.
I thought there's a Wyandotte County in Kansas.
I know.
Yeah.
It's all part, 1840s. It was our own little Trail of Tears. Any rate, one of the things that I've been promoting for the last several years, and I'm going to be doing so again, I'm running for Ohio House in the 24 cycle, is to push for a state public bank modeled after the Bank of North Dakota, which was interestingly enough, that was started by Eugene Debs.
Is that right?
Yep. And the conservatives took it over. They first hated it, and then they fell in love with it. The only state public bank in the country right now, and been in existence for over 100 years. It could solve many of the issues brought up by the things that you've raised and what the other callers have brought attention to, particularly rural healthcare. The other thing too about values, I belong to an organization called Dems 101. If you have not heard of the book, The Democratic Creed, written by Jim Purvis, I suggest you go out and do it. Read the first chapter, dems101.org. That's free. We talk about values. One of the issues that we face across the country, not just in Ohio, is how do we connect with these people that are voting against their own interests? And it comes down to values and kitchen table issues like we've been talking about. That's why I'm pushing the public bank, because it could solve a number of rural issues and urban ones as well. And
sounds like a good idea.
I want to use this, and by pushing through that negative, that non-reporting that we see in rural America, because these are conservative publications that have been monopolized. In order to get through that, I'm pushing the Ohio Democratic Party this weekend with a statement outlining my goals for public bank, hoping to get that big idea that can be reported back out into the hinterland. And then we start breaking through these barriers. So these are the things that I've been working on for the past couple of years. These are the things that I've been working on for the next cycle. And I think it addresses a number of things that we're talking about right now. And that's my platform.
Yes. So I'm not a big expert on the Bank of North Dakota, but you know, that's, yeah, I should
do the YouTube. It's 5 minutes, 10 minutes. You'll learn about public banking very quickly. But
there is one other chapter of populism that that you might be interested in. So this is after they got beaten in America, you know, late 1890s. A lot of the populists went to Canada. It's kind of a strange story, but they went to Canada and they started a party up there. Oh, geez, what was the name of the party? It had a very long-winded name, but they were especially powerful in. Man, look how I should have read up on this before I came out here and started talking to you guys. I wrote a whole chapter about it in the paperback edition of The People Know. Anyhow, they got public health care done in Canada. It was their single issue. Which province was this in? Was this Saskatchewan? I believe it was. And this was their, you know, the Great Plains. These are full-on populists, moved up there, started a political party, had this one issue that they were focused on, and then they finally took power in the 1960s. This is 80 years later, 80 years after the beginnings of populism, and they got it done. And then that it was so powerful and effective. What was the name of that party in Saskatchewan? It was so powerful and effective that the rest of Canada wanted it, and that was the acorn of their national healthcare system. And this all goes back to populism, to our guys. And when they were fighting to get this healthcare system done, you know who opposed them? Of course, the elites. The medical association. They threatened a doctor's. They tried to pull off a doctor's strike, you know, stuff like that. And the populists won, and they got universal health care in Canada. So hooray.
Hooray. Great note to end on. We could talk to you all afternoon, but we're going to let you go. Thank you so much. This has been really interesting. The chat has been really interesting. I can send that to you later so you can see what people were talking about. But clearly, you know, really hit a nerve with a lot of people whose family have roots as Midwestern farmers and were involved in populist politics going way back. So really come full circle here. Great stuff. Thank you so much, Thomas. Thanks everyone for joining us. And we will see you next month.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.